Everyone says time heals all wounds, but at Love and Scars stories, we know some scars never fade. They simply learn how to breathe. Today's story is about Hattie Voss and Asha Boone, where buried grief becomes quiet strength. Out on the lonely stretch of the western frontier, everything begins with a simple act. One woman answering a handwritten sign that says, "Help Wanted." Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. In the year 1884, the land beyond Copper Creek lay under a silence that felt almost deliberate. Not the gentle hush that comes with dusk, but a heavier quiet. One that pressed down on the earth like a held breath. The days there stretched long and punishing. The sun scorched the ground until the soil cracked and the air trembled with heat, as if the land itself were wavering between endurance and surrender. When night finally arrived, it brought cold with it, along with the distant cries of coyotes echoing off the ridgelines. The high ground rose above the valley like a lonely watchtower, its stone edges guarding a place where little dared to grow. It was harsh country, unforgiving. And it was there that Asha Boone had chosen to live. Asha lived alone. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and deliberate in every movement, as if he carried the weight of the land within him. At 33, he should have been in the prime of his life. Yet his face told another story, one etched by loss rather than age. The sun had darkened his skin, the wind had toughened it. His hair hung long, tied back out of habit more than vanity. His gray eyes stayed guarded, watchful, as though the world had taught him that anything worth loving could be taken away without warning. The few neighbors scattered miles apart spoke of him rarely. When they did, they called him a man who kept to himself. Some said he moved like a ghost through his own life. They were not wrong. There had been a time when his home carried sound, laughter drifting through open doors, warmth clinging to the walls, a time when the house felt like a beginning. That was before. 2 winters earlier, a fever had swept through the valley without mercy. It came fast, burning through flesh and hope alike. Asha Boone, a man capable of breaking wild horses and shaping timber with his hands, had been rendered powerless. No strength could stop it. No weapon could fight it. He watched the illness claim Sarah Boone, his wife. He watched it steal the child she carried. When the sickness finally loosened its grip on the land, it left Asha standing alone among the ruins of his life. Since then, words had grown scarce. He spoke only when necessary. He worked without pause. Each day, he buried his grief in routine, mending, building, fixing what could be fixed. Because some wounds could not be touched by hands, no matter how strong. The house he had built still stood firm against the elements, solid, enduring. But inside, it carried the weight of everything that was no longer there. The corral posts still stood straight and solid, set deep into the hard ground. But the man who moved among them had been hollowed out by silence for nearly 2 years. Asha Boone lived like that now. He rose before first light, when the world was still cold and colorless. He worked until his muscles burned and his hands numbed, and he slept only when his body finally gave in to exhaustion. He ate sparingly, salted meat torn by hand, hard biscuits that cracked between his teeth, coffee boiled black and bitter. Food meant nothing more than survival, fuel to keep him upright. Comfort had no place in his days, company even less. He did not seek relief from his loneliness. He simply endured it. But even a man built like stone will fracture when left alone long enough. It wasn't that Asha longed for conversation or laughter. It was that the house had grown too empty, even for him. The quiet inside it pressed heavier than the vast land outside. The silence became something you could feel. It clung to the walls. It filled every room like a shroud. And so, a few weeks before everything changed, Asha did something he never expected of himself. He took a rough plank of wood and a branding iron. As the iron hissed and bit into the grain, the smell of burned timber filled the air. He scorched a few blunt words into the board. Help wanted. Cooking. Care for stock. Nothing more. He carried the sign to the edge of his land, near the wagon road where dust never truly settled, and nailed it to a weathered post. The hammer rang sharp in the open air. He did not put it up because he believed someone would answer. Who would ride this far, to the edge of nowhere, to work for a silent, broken man? No. He put it up because the emptiness inside the house had grown louder than the wind outside. Weeks passed. Riders came and went. Wagons rolled by. Men glanced at the sign, took in the lonely stretch of land, the isolated house, and kept moving. One by one, they disappeared down the road. Asha watched them from his porch, arms crossed over his chest, hat pulled low against the sun. His eyes followed them without expression, sharp, distant, unreadable, like a hawk circling high above the desert. He expected nothing. He expected the silence to last forever. But fate rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, on an ordinary afternoon, when dust lifts along a wagon road and the air carries the dry scent of mesquite. It was early spring. The land was parched, the sky washed pale with heat. Down that long, empty road came a small cart. Its wheels groaned with every turn. The horse pulling it was little more than bone and hide, stumbling under exhaustion. But the woman holding the reins sat upright despite the strain. She appeared to be around 30. Her dark hair was pulled back beneath a plain bonnet. Her face was pale from travel, yet set with a calm, unyielding strength. Her dress was worn thin by miles of dust, the hem frayed from the road. She guided the cart to a slow, careful stop. And for the first time in years, Asha Boone did not turn away from the road. She stopped near the weather-beaten sign Asha Boone had nailed to the post weeks earlier. He had seen her coming long before she reached it, the rising plume of dust marking her slow approach down the road. Asha stood on the porch, one shoulder resting against a support beam, watching without moving. He watched as she climbed down from the cart. Her boots met the dirt with a solid, practiced step, the kind that came from too many miles and too many hard days. She lifted her gaze toward the house. She took in the wind-scoured timbers, the sagging porch, the windows dulled by neglect and time. Another traveler might have turned back right then. Most would have seen the labor waiting here, the isolation, the sorrow worn into the bones of the place, and chosen easier ground. She did not. She straightened her shoulders and walked toward the porch where Asha stood, still as a man guarding a life built for solitude. "You the owner?" she asked. Her voice was steady, edged with the fatigue of the trail, but not weakened by it. Asha gave a single nod. "Name's Asha Boone." She paused only a breath before answering. "Hattie Voss. I saw the sign." His eyes flicked briefly to the plank nailed beside the road, then back to her face. He felt the urge to warn her rise in his chest, to tell her this was no place for beginnings, no place for healing. "Plenty of folks ride past that sign," he said. "I didn't," she replied. The wind pressed against the porch boards, making them creak. Somewhere out in the brush, a grasshopper snapped its wings. The silence between them stretched thin and tight. But for the first time in 2 years, the quiet carried a question. Asha studied her more closely. He saw the exhaustion etched into her features, the dust clinging to the hem of her skirt. But he saw something else too. Grief set deep, familiar as his own. "Don't need trouble here," he said at last. "I've had my fill of it." Her answer came soft, but unshaken. "I'm not looking for trouble, just honest work." That landed heavier than he expected. He glanced past her to the cart, a single trunk, a mandolin case strapped alongside it. That was all she owned by the look of it. A small life, carried on tired wheels. It reminded him of his own house. Cold stove, empty rooms, a silence that never left. He looked back at Hattie Voss, standing firm in the dust. After a long moment, he spoke. "Kitchen's round back. Side rooms are empty. Hand pumps by the well." She gave a slight nod. "That'll do." There was no handshake, no smile, just two people standing on opposite sides of a hollow doorway neither had opened in years. As she passed him to retrieve her trunk, Hattie Voss's skirt brushed against Asha Boone's coat, just for a heartbeat, a small thing, barely worth noticing. Yet Asha felt it the way dry grass feels a spark. Sudden, unsettling, impossible to ignore. And in that brief instant, the hollow man was no longer entirely alone. The silence that ruled this place had begun to shift. There is a particular sound a wagon makes after too many miles across high desert land. A dry, rhythmic complaint? Wood grinding against iron, wheels protesting every inch of unforgiving earth. That sound cut through the quiet on this early spring afternoon, breaking the long-held stillness of the mesa. It announced an arrival the land itself had not asked for. The air was brittle and dry, carrying the sharp, sweet scent of mesquite mixed with dust. The woman holding the reins sat upright, steady despite the journey behind her. The horse told another story. The poor animal was little more than bone and hide, its head hanging low as it dragged the cart forward, worn down by sun and distance. But the woman did not bow with it. She appeared to be around 30. Her dark hair was pulled back beneath a plain bonnet faded by time and travel. Her face was pale, drawn by the rigors of the trail, dust clinging to her skin. Yet beneath the weariness lay something firmer, quiet resolve. Her dress was simple. The hem was frayed from miles of grit and dirt. She guided the cart to a stop beside the weathered sign Asha Boone had nailed to the post weeks earlier. Help wanted cooking. Care for stock. She climbed down from the cart. Her boots met the dirt with a solid, practiced step, one shaped by long roads and longer hardships. She did not study the ground beneath her feet. She looked up. She took in the house, its timbers worn smooth by wind. The porch sagged under the weight of years. The windows had dulled with neglect and silence. Most would have seen a ruin, a place where hope had long since dried up and blown away with the dust. She did not turn back. She squared her shoulders, drew a breath of the thin desert air, and walked toward the porch where Asha stood waiting. He had watched her approach for nearly a mile. His arms were folded across his chest, his hat pulled low to shade his eyes. His gaze was sharp, unreadable, like the hawk circling high above in the blue sky. He was a man who had forgotten how to welcome another soul. A man who wore solitude like armor. "You the owner?" she asked. Her voice was even, steady, roughened slightly by dust and distance, but unbroken. Asha gave a single, curt nod. Name's Asha Boone. She hesitated only a moment before lifting her eyes fully to his. Hattie Voss, she said. I'm Hattie Voss. I saw the sign. Asha Boone's eyes flicked to the plank nailed to the post, the burned letters catching the light, then returned to her face. He hadn't wanted this. He hadn't wanted anyone crossing that line between road and home. Plenty of folks ride past that sign, he said, the warning plain in his voice. I didn't, she answered. Silence settled between them again. The wind pressed against the porch boards, drawing a low groan from the wood. Somewhere in the brush, a grasshopper clicked out a steady rhythm. It felt less like a pause and more like a standoff. Two people long removed from the ease of conversation. At last, Asha spoke. You know stock? Cooking? Hattie lifted her chin. I do, and I work hard. He studied her then, looking past the dust on her clothes, past the fatigue she made no effort to hide. He found exhaustion there, yes, but also something deeper. Sorrow, pressed down and carried quietly. The same look he saw in his own reflection each morning. Don't need trouble here? He said flatly. I've had my share. Her reply came soft but steady. I'm not looking for trouble. Just honest work. The sincerity in her voice struck him harder than he expected. He glanced past her to the cart. One trunk, a mandolin case tied beside it. That was all. Everything she owned, bound together with rope. Not much of a life, he thought. It reminded him of his own house. The cold stove, the empty rooms, the silence that clung to every corner like a burial cloth. He stood there a long moment. Then he motioned vaguely toward the building behind him. Kitchens round back, side rooms are empty, hand pumps by the well. She gave a small nod. That'll suit me fine. There was no handshake, no smile. Just two strangers standing on opposite sides of a hollowed doorway. Neither had truly opened in years. Hattie turned back to the cart to fetch her trunk. Asha watched without offering help, perhaps out of habit, perhaps because he sensed she wouldn't take it. She lifted the heavy trunk herself and carried it across the porch with a steady, unbroken stride. And then it happened. Nothing worth remarking on. A small thing, really. As she passed him on the narrow boards, her skirt brushed his coat for no more than a second. A fleeting contact, easily dismissed. Yet to a man who had turned to stone, who hadn't felt the nearness of another human being in 2 long winters, it landed like a strike of flint. A spark in dry grass, unexpected, unsettling, dangerous. Inside, the house waited in dim silence. The air inside the house felt closed and unmoving. Curtains hung slack, heavy with years of dust. The floorboards groaned softly beneath Hattie Voss's boots as she stepped farther into the dim interior. She paused and took it in. There was emptiness, yes. But where others might have seen only abandonment, Hattie saw something else. She saw the bare frame of a home, waiting, patient, unfinished. She carried her trunk into one of the side rooms and set it down near the wall. Her hand brushed across the rough surface of the old dresser. The wood was coarse, worn by time, but solid. It was real. It was shelter. That was enough. She didn't linger. She moved back toward the kitchen, where the stove sat cold and dark, unused. Asha Boone stood just inside the doorway, having followed her no farther. Do you have coffee? She asked. Asha blinked, as though pulled from deep thought. Beans are in the jar by the shelf, he said. Hattie untied her bonnet and shook the dust from her hair. Without another word, she set to work. She filled the kettle at the pump, measured the beans, struck a match. A flame caught. Soon the crackle of fire broke the silence. It was not the thin, reluctant heat of a man simply keeping warm. It was the deliberate fire of a hearth being awakened. A sound the house had not known in a long time. The faint, rich smell of coffee began to rise. Asha remained in the doorway, watching. It felt strange, unnerving even. Years had passed since another person had moved with purpose through that kitchen. Years since the house had held the rhythm of work that was not his own. Hattie did not fill the space with talk. She asked no questions. She worked quietly, the way people do when they understand silence too well to fear it. Asha found himself leaning against the doorframe longer than he meant to, held there by the simple sight of her hands moving. Steady, practiced, certain. When the coffee was ready, she poured 2 cups. She set one on the table across from her own, not asking if he wanted it. Then she sat. Asha looked at the cup. Steam curled upward from the dark surface. He lifted his eyes to her face. She met his gaze without hesitation. There was no smile, not warmth, not yet. It was recognition. The quiet understanding shared by 2 people who had both buried more than they cared to speak aloud. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. The mesa stretched vast and unmoved beneath the sky. But inside the house, something shifted. For the first time in a long while, Asha Boone felt the air change, just enough to know that something had entered his life, along with the woman named Hattie Voss. Neither of them spoke it. Yet as they sat there, drinking bitter coffee in the dim light, both understood the same truth. The silence was no longer empty. It was waiting. The next morning, dawn broke over the mesa. Pale light spilling across the desert floor. The air held a biting cold. The kind of high desert chill that seeps straight into bone before the sun has any chance to tame it. Asha Boone rose before daylight, the way he always did. He pulled on his boots and stepped out toward the corral, expecting the familiar emptiness that had ruled his mornings for 2 long years. Silence. The scrape of hooves. Wind moving through dry grass. The steady thud of his own heart. But when he stepped off the porch, he stopped short. The house behind him was not quiet. A faint clatter drifted through the morning air, metal tapping against wood. Then came the low hiss of a fire being carefully coaxed to life. Asha frowned and glanced back at the chimney. Smoke curled upward. For the first time in years, it rose before he had lit the stove himself. When he returned inside after tending the stock, the scent met him at the door. Coffee, strong enough to jolt a man awake, mingled with the smell of bread warming near the hearth. Beneath it lingered the earthy aroma of herbs simmering gently in a pot. The table he had long abandoned stood set. A clean cloth lay across the wood. Biscuits rested on a plate, still warm. Hattie Voss stood at the stove, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair tied back, moving with quiet purpose. She turned when she heard his heavy boots on the floorboards. "You're back early," she said, as casually as if he'd only stepped outside for a moment. Asha looked from the table to her, suspicion tangling with something close to disbelief. "You didn't have to cook," he said. She answered without looking up. "I did. A house doesn't breathe without it." He hesitated, then pulled out a chair and sat. She poured a cup of coffee and slid it across the table toward him. He lifted it, took a sip, and nearly startled at the taste. strong, bitter, alive. It had been many winters since Asha had sat down to a real breakfast. His late wife, Sarah Boone, had once filled mornings with meals like this. Venison stew, fry bread, roasted beans. After she was gone, he had eaten only to remain standing. Dried meat, hardtack, food reduced to fuel, nothing more. But when Hattie placed a plate of scrambled eggs and warm bread before him, something stirred beneath the weight he carried. He picked up his fork slowly, almost uncertain of the motion. Hattie sat across from him with a modest plate of her own. She did not chatter. She did not crowd the silence. She ate quietly, glancing at him once, as if waiting to see whether he would push the food away. He didn't. He finished every bite. When the bread was gone, Asha Boone pushed the plate away and released a long, measured breath. "There's more in the pot if you want," Hattie Voss said, a faint smile touching her mouth. He shook his head. "That's enough." The quiet settled between them again. But it wasn't the heavy silence of before. It didn't press down like stone. It rested easily, the kind that forms when two people share a table and ask nothing more of the moment. And so the days found a rhythm. Hattie rose before the sun, filling the kitchen with warmth and movement. Asha returned from the corral to the smell of something simmering. He never asked her to do it. She never asked for permission. When the work grew heavy, she didn't stay inside. She stepped into it. She hauled water to the troughs, scattered grain for the chickens. One afternoon, Asha found her along the fence line, hammer in hand, setting a leaning post straight. He watched from a distance, a frown settling as he took in the sight of her laboring in the dust. She finished clean and steady. "You didn't have to," he said again. Hattie wiped her hands on her apron and met his eyes. "Neither did you when you built this place." "But you did." Asha had no answer for that. One evening, after a long day riding the range, he came back worn and dusted with grit. As he stepped inside, he stopped short. The door to the side room where Hattie stayed stood half open. Warm lamplight spilled into the hall. He caught a glimpse of her bent over her small trunk, a mandolin resting in her lap. Her fingers plucked a simple tune, something like a lullaby. It drifted softly through the house, wrapping around him before he could turn away. He hadn't heard music here since Sarah Boone's voice had gone silent. He stood longer than he meant to, listening. Then he moved away, without a sound. The next morning, he left something on the kitchen table, a knife with a carved handle, the work of his own hands from years past. He said nothing about it. When he returned that evening, he saw it resting on the windowsill where the light caught the grain of the wood. Hattie didn't mention it. So began their quiet exchange. Asha would leave something small, a pouch of dried berries, a carved hairpin, a handful of yucca fibers. Hattie would place them where they belonged, not hiding them away, but giving them space. In return, she left signs for him. An extra biscuit wrapped in cloth near his saddle, a sprig of mint laid on the windowsill. Nothing spoken, nothing demanded. Just two lives learning, slowly, how to acknowledge one another in silence. They spoke little, yet in those small, quiet exchanges, the house began to feel less empty. Late one afternoon, as the sun dipped low and turned the mesa gold, Asha Boone paused along the fence line. Beyond the far ridge, a shadow moved. The wild Mustang, a gray stallion, its mane dark as storm clouds, proud and untouched. It had lingered on the land for months, never allowing a man close, never staying long enough to be claimed. A creature of distance and defiance. Hattie Voss came to the fence, wiping her hands on her skirt, and stood beside him. They watched the horse move with restless grace. "He's beautiful," she said. Asha gave a low grunt. "Wild. You don't break a horse like that. He comes and goes as he pleases." Hattie watched the stallion toss its head, the muscles shifting beneath its hide. A faint smile curved her lips. "Maybe it's not meant to be broken," she said quietly. "Maybe it just needs someone patient enough to wait." Asha turned and looked at her, longer than he meant to. Her words landed deeper than the sight of the Mustang itself. He faced the horizon again, saying nothing. That night, they ate together once more. The lamp burned low, throwing long shadows across the walls. Asha sat with his coffee. Hattie worked her needle through cloth, steady and unhurried. The silence held, not heavy, not lonely, comfortable. At last, Hattie spoke into it. "I know you didn't plan on me being here," she said. "And I know I stepped in where I wasn't asked. If it's too much—" Asha stopped her. His voice was rough, but there was no edge to it. "It's not." She looked up, surprised. He met her gaze across the table. For the first time, his eyes weren't guarded. "It's been a long while since this place felt lived in," he said. "You changed that." Hattie said nothing. Her eyes softened. She lowered her head and returned to her sewing, a faint smile touching her mouth. Outside, the desert night stretched wide and dark. But inside Lone Mesa, two people shared a silence that no longer hollowed them out. It filled them. Spring pressed deeper into the land, though spring here carried no gentleness. The desert did not soften with the season. It answered change with force. The rains came hard and sudden, riding the wind down from the high ridges like a stampede. By mid-May, the sky darkened to a bruised, heavy purple. Thunder rolled across the horizon like distant drums, shaking the ground beneath the floorboards. Asha Boone had noticed the signs all afternoon, the way the air grew heavy, the way the stock turned restless and then fell quiet. He knew what was coming. A storm on the mesa could swallow a man whole, and he meant to have his animals secured before the sky finally broke. He worked fast at the corral, hands moving with urgency. Knots pulled tight. The feed shed latched down. Every second mattered. Across the yard, Hattie Voss stood at the wash line, pinning shirts into place when the first heavy drops struck the dirt, bursting into small clouds of dust. Asha shouted over the rising wind, his voice cutting through the gusts. "Leave it! Get inside!" Hattie shook her head, clutching the damp cloth to her chest, stubborn as the land itself. "They'll be ruined," she called back. "Better wet than gone," he shouted. The storm gave them no time to argue. Rain slammed down in a sudden sheet, a wall of water dropping from the sky. In seconds, the world turned gray and deafening. The hard-packed yard softened into slick mud beneath their boots. Asha cursed under his breath and ran for the corral. The wind had torn the heavy gate wide open. A steer bawled in panic, its weight pressing hard against the rails, threatening to burst free. Asha threw his shoulder into the wood, boots sliding as he fought to force it closed. The wind and the animal pushed back, relentless. Then he felt another weight beside him. Hattie. She had abandoned the laundry without a second thought, dropped it straight into the mud. She stood shoulder to shoulder with him, boots sinking deep, breath hard and steady. Together, they heaved against the gate. Lightning split the sky. Thunder cracked so close it rattled their teeth. Neither flinched. Asha strained against the pressure while Hattie braced the bar, holding it steady long enough for him to drive it home. Without a word, she was already moving, running for the shed where the chickens flapped and shrieked in terror. Asha followed. He grabbed a loose shutter and slammed it back into place, hammering it tight against the wall as Hattie gathered the birds, one after another. Rain lashed down, the storm roaring around them in a frenzy of wind and noise. Yet inside that chaos, they moved as one. No commands, no wasted breath, only instinct and trust. At last, the corral held. The shed stood firm. Asha caught her arm and shouted over the rain, "Enough! Inside, now!" They ran together across the yard, clothes soaked and heavy, and burst onto the porch. Breathless, they leaned against the doorframe, water pooling at their feet, chests heaving as the storm battered the land around them. For a long moment, neither spoke. They simply stood there, drenched and gasping, watching the rain hammer the mesa into submission. Then Hattie Voss laughed. It started small, breathless, surprised, before breaking free, bright and unguarded against the roar of the storm. As if startled by her own reaction, Hattie Voss pushed her rain-soaked hair back from her face. "Well," she said, catching her breath, "that was a welcome like no other." Asha Boone blinked at her. It wasn't the storm that had unsettled him. It was the sound of laughter in his house again. Water dripped from the brim of his hat as he shook his head, a half-smile pulling at his mouth despite himself. "You'd have rather I let the whole place blow down," she teased lightly as they moved inside, toward the warmth of the kitchen. Asha shook his head. "You did good." The words were simple, but Hattie felt the weight behind them. That night, they ate by lantern light while the storm hammered the roof overhead. When the plates were cleared, Hattie leaned back in her chair, exhaustion softening her features. "It's strange," she murmured, eyes half-lidded. "Even storms feel less lonely when there's someone else to see them through." Asha looked at her, lamplight catching the hollow lines of his face. He thought of the nights he'd endured alone, of Sarah Boone's voice long gone quiet. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said enough. Peace, he realized, wasn't always emptiness. Sometimes it was simply waiting. But the desert was a land of extremes. The relief brought by the rain didn't last. Summer arrived early that year, heavy and unyielding. Days burned bright as brass. The sun heated the mesa stones until they could blister skin, and sweat stung the eyes the moment a man stepped outside. Asha worked through it all. He repaired fence lines, drove cattle toward higher ground where a thin ribbon of water still ran, and hauled supplies back from Santa Cruz. He spoke little of the strain, but Hattie saw it anyway. She noticed the deeper creases at his brow, the slower way he pulled off his boots at night. One evening, he returned later than usual. His horse was lathered, dust clinging thick to his shirt. Supper waited warm on the stove. "You've been gone since before sunrise," Hattie said, rising to pour him coffee. "Didn't stop to eat." Asha shook his head as he lowered himself heavily into a chair. Too much to be done. She set the cup before him, studying his face. Beneath the tan, his skin looked pale. His lips were dry. When he lifted the coffee, his hand trembled. "You're worn down to the bone," she said softly. "I'll be fine," he answered, forcing a swallow. He grimaced as the coffee went down, as if it burned more than it should. By the time night settled in, it was clear he wasn't fine at all. A low, harsh cough tore from his chest, breaking the quiet of the room. As Hattie Voss laid her hand against Asha Boone's forehead, heat scorched her palm. "Asha," she whispered, fear tightening her throat. "You're burning up." He stirred beneath the blanket, eyes half-lidded. "Just tired," he muttered. "No," she said, firm despite the tremor in her voice. "This is more than tired." Hattie sat back on her heels, pressing her hands hard against her knees to still their shaking. The room tilted. She had seen this before. The sweat, the shivers, the fevered heat beneath the skin. Her mind lurched backward to another bed, another man's hand burning in hers. Thomas Voss coughing until his chest rattled, his eyes searching her face as she crushed herbs and whispered prayers she barely believed in. She had been a healer once, a doctor's wife, and nothing she tried had saved him. She remembered the weight of the earth on her hands as she buried him, dirt packed beneath her nails, roots she had gathered herself, medicines that failed. That was the day she walked away. She had sworn never to touch it again. They had called her unlucky, cursed, and she had believed them. Now, standing over Asha, listening to his rough, broken breathing, that same terror closed in, tight as a fist around her chest. Every instinct screamed to flee the room, to let nature take its course. It was easier not to try than to fail again. Then Asha groaned, twisting weakly beneath the sheets. He was alone in this house. Except for her. If she turned away, there would be no one. Hattie stood abruptly. She grabbed a basin, filled it at the pump, wrung a cloth hard, and pressed it to his forehead. Her movements were sharp, almost angry, at the fever, at fate, at herself for hesitating. "You don't get to leave me too," she muttered under her breath. At dawn, she made her choice. She stepped into the breaking light, boots crunching over gravel, and headed for the dry wash where she knew the herbs still grew. Sage, yarrow, mint. Her hands trembled as she gathered them, but she did not stop. Back at the kitchen table, she chopped, measured, brewed. The smell rose sharp and bitter, the scent of her past, the scent of her grief. She poured the mixture into a cup and carried it to his bedside. "Asha," she said softly, lifting his head. "You have to drink." He coughed, choked, but he swallowed. The hours stretched long and heavy. Hattie kept watch, head bowed in prayers she barely remembered how to shape. She cooled his skin, sponged his arms and chest, and stayed. She did not leave. She murmured steady words, soft and unbroken, keeping him tethered to the world. Toward evening, she felt it, the fever loosening its grip. Sweat beaded along his temples, no longer burning, but cooling. His breathing slowed. His body eased into true sleep. Hattie Voss sank back into the chair, exhaustion crashing over her all at once. Her hands carried the sharp scent of sage and mint. Her dress was blotched with sweat and broth. She closed her eyes, resting her forehead against the edge of the bed, and let the dark pull her under. It was deep night when Asha Boone woke again. The lantern burned low. He blinked, confused, the room drifting back into shape. Then he felt the weight near his hand. Hattie sat slumped in the chair, her head cradled on her arm against the mattress. He watched her for a long moment. Memory filtered through the haze, the cool cloth on his skin, the bitter bite of herbs, her voice urging him to stay. "Hattie," he whispered, his throat raw. She stirred, lifting her head. Her eyes were shadowed with fatigue. But when they found his, relief softened her whole face. "You're awake," she breathed. Asha swallowed. His voice scraped out. "You stayed." She shook her head. "Don't." A pause. "I only did what I swore I'd never do again." "What do you mean?" She looked down at her hands, still faintly green-stained. "I was a healer once," she said quietly. "My husband, Thomas Voss, fell ill. I tried everything. Nothing worked." Her breath caught, then steadied. "When he died, I buried that part of myself with him. I thought if I never touched it again, I wouldn't have to fail twice." She lifted her eyes to him. "And then there was you. I couldn't stand by. I had to try." Asha held her gaze, steady despite the weakness pulling at his limbs. He reached out, rough fingers brushing hers where they rested on the quilt. "If you hadn't," he said, "I'd be gone." He tightened his grip as much as he could. "You didn't fail me, Hattie. You gave me back the breath in my chest." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't know if I can carry that weight again," she whispered. His hand was weak, but sure. "Then don't carry it alone." She froze. The words sank deeper than the fever ever had. The storm outside had passed days before. But in that room, another one finally broke, leaving behind something tender, fragile, and alive. And alive. They were no longer just two people sharing a roof. They were two survivors who had, in their own quiet ways, pulled each other back from the edge. By late summer, the land had hardened once more. Storm grasses turned brittle, snapping underfoot. The washes dried to pale scars, like old bones laid bare. On the surface, life at the ranch slipped back into its familiar rhythm. Hattie Voss tended narrow rows of beans and tomatoes that fought the heat inch by inch, while Asha Boone rode the range from dawn until the sun fell low. Yet beneath that calm, something simmered. It was no longer the unease of strangers. It was the strain of words swallowed down, of feelings kept low and watchful, like coyotes crouched in the brush, waiting. The blow came on a Tuesday. Asha returned from Santa Cruz with a storm written across his face. He stepped into the kitchen and set a folded letter on the table without a word. Hattie was drying dishes. She caught the dark set of his jaw, the tightness around his eyes. "What is it?" she asked. Asha sat, elbows on his knees, staring at the floorboards as if they might answer for him. "Notice from the county office," he said flatly. "If I can't show legal heir, they'll review my claim to this land." Hattie set the dish aside, her movements slow and careful. "But this is yours," she said. "You worked it. You built it." His mouth tightened. Paper doesn't care about sweat. The silence that followed pressed in hard. Hattie felt a flicker of fear, not just for the land, but for what it meant to him. This place was his fortress, his penance. Now he looked at it like a proud man trapped in a fight against ink and law, enemies he could not outwork. "Asha," she began. He rose abruptly. "Leave it be," he muttered, and walked out into the yard. For 2 days, the house held its breath. The silence returned, but it was no longer gentle. It strained at the seams. Asha sat on the porch for hours, staring at the stars, while the scratch of Hattie's needle and thread sounded loud in the hush. The breaking point came on a warm night in early September. Cicadas screamed in the mesquite, relentless in the dark. Supper was finished. Hattie lingered at the table, tracing the grain of the wood with her finger. Asha stood by the hearth, arms folded tight across his chest. At last he spoke. His voice was low, stripped of the armor he had worn for so long. "When the fever took my wife and my boy," he said, staring into the cold fireplace, "I kept telling myself I should have done more, found better medicine, fought harder, something, anything." Asha Boone shook his head slowly. "Truth is, I couldn't save them, and I don't know if I've ever forgiven myself for that." Hattie Voss felt her breath snag in her chest. She looked at his back and saw her own guilt reflected there. "I know what that feels like," she whispered. "My husband, Thomas Voss, he died. And I was helpless." She swallowed, steadying herself. "I told myself if I'd been wiser, faster, braver, maybe he'd still be here. People called me cursed, and maybe I believed them." Asha turned then. He faced her fully, and the rawness in his expression startled her. Hattie's voice trembled, but she didn't look away. "And now I'm sitting across from you. You're alive because I broke that oath. And I think maybe I'm not cursed after all." The silence that filled the room wasn't empty. It quivered. Asha stepped closer, moving slow, as if each pace cost him something. When he reached her, he stopped. His hands curled at his sides, then opened. "I don't want to lose this land," he said softly. "But more than that, I don't want to lose you." Tears slipped down Hattie's cheeks before she could stop them. She rose and closed the space between them until she could feel the warmth of his breath. "You won't," she whispered. "Unless you ask me to go." He lifted a calloused hand and touched her cheek, tentative, as if afraid she might vanish like smoke. She leaned into his palm and closed her eyes. The kiss was unhurried, not fierce with the fire of youth. It was steady, earned. The kiss of two weary souls laying their burdens down, side by side. Later they sat together on the porch bench. The desert night spread wide before them, scented with sage and cooling earth. Asha's arm rested along the back of the bench, Hattie close at his side. "Whatever the papers say about heirs," Hattie murmured. "Maybe the land just needed two people willing to tend it together." Asha turned to her, his gaze steady in the moonlight. "And maybe," he said, "I just needed someone patient enough to wait." On the ridge, the silhouette of the wild Mustang stood watch. For the first time, to Asha's eyes, the horse looked less like a ghost and more like a promise. Autumn came to Lone Mesa with cooler nights, the desert air turning crisp, and the stars burned sharper against the blackened sky. The long, punishing heat of summer finally loosened its grip, giving way to winds that whispered through yucca and mesquite. For the first time in years, the turning of the season felt like a promise instead of a loss. Asha Boone and Hattie Voss slipped into a new rhythm. Quiet, but certain. She still rose before dawn to coax life into the stove. He still rode out early to check the stock, but now, when he came back through the door, her smile was waiting. And when they sat down to supper, he reached across the table and laid his hand over hers, as natural as breathing. They didn't rush to name what they were becoming. It didn't need a name. The land itself seemed to understand. One evening, Asha came in from the barn, carrying something wrapped in cloth. Hattie was kneading dough, sleeves rolled high, flour dusting her apron. He set the bundle on the table and asked her to open it. Inside lay a necklace carved from bone, delicate, polished, smooth, until it caught the lamplight. It was shaped like the petals of a desert flower, My mother's design, Asha said quietly. Where I come from, it means a bond chosen, not by blood, not by obligation, by the heart. Hattie touched the cool bone, her fingers trembling. She looked up at him, eyes steady and bright. Are you asking me to stay? Asha shook his head gently. No need to ask. You already have. Word spread, as it always did in the West. When they rode into Santa Cruz for supplies, people noticed. They saw Asha Boone, the solitary rancher, walking beside a woman, Hattie Voss, the widow who once carried whispers of misfortune behind her name. Some stared with curiosity, others with judgment. Asha silenced them all without raising his voice. When he introduced her, he did it plain and firm. This is Hattie, he said. She keeps my house, and she keeps my heart. For the first time in years, Hattie felt no shadow of shame trailing her steps. She stood tall, unafraid of the light. Back at the ranch, the garden Hattie planted grew strong despite the dry ground. Near the porch, the yucca Asha once gave her burst into bloom, great white flowers opening bold against the desert sky. They married right there, beneath those blossoms. No church bells, no grand gathering, just a traveling reverend standing in the dust with a Bible, and a handful of Copper Creek neighbors bearing witness. Hattie wore her best dress, the bone-carved necklace resting at her throat. When the vows were spoken, Asha Boone leaned down and kissed Hattie Voss. It wasn't the kiss of a man claiming something earned. It was the kiss of a man finding his way back to himself. And as if the land chose that moment to offer its own blessing, the gray stallion, the wild ghost of the ridges, finally came down. One dawn, Asha found the horse standing quiet at the corral fence. It didn't bolt. It didn't challenge. It only watched, ears forward, steady as stone. Asha smiled, a slow, unguarded smile he hadn't worn in years. Looks like even the wild finds a place to belong, he said. Hattie slid her hand into his. So did we, she whispered. That summer, a child's cry rose beneath the endless desert sky. Copper Creek heard it carry across the flats, and Lone Mesa was no longer a place haunted by quiet. It became a chosen home, a living one, held together by two people who had carried grief, faced fear, and found, at last, the courage to love again. This is the story of Asha Boone and Hattie Voss. It reminds us that no matter how hollow a house feels, no matter how heavy the silence presses, the heart can learn to beat again. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening and for allowing this story to speak to your heart. The Wild West still holds countless truths, some painful, some tender, all worth remembering. Stay with us, subscribe, comment, and invite others to discover these untamed stories. From our hearts to yours, thank you for being part of this journey. Aviso legal. Disclaimer: each story shared here is produced for storytelling enjoyment. Certain scenes may include fictional or dramatized elements inspired by historical circumstances. Although AI tools assist us in visuals, narration, and script development, the emotional tone, editing, and quality control are conducted by people to ensure meaningful experiences. We fully uphold YouTube's policies, using no deceptive recreations or impersonations of real individuals. All creative resources are properly licensed. Unauthorized copying, re-uploading, or remixing is not permitted. Thank you for supporting the effort behind every episode we create.